So we're now going to move to our first panel, and as Milka explained, the way that we're going to run this morning session is there are two sessions. And the first session is we're going to look at the particular case of antibiotics, because that's one where clearly the business case doesn't work. There will never be, or there should never be, the large volume in sales that could provide the return on investment. So clearly we need to test our approach to new models using antibiotics. So I'm going to introduce all of our panelists and invite them to come up and join me. And we're going to add one more chair because we will need that. I have joining me in this first session, Dr. Rosa Castro, who's the Senior Advocacy Officer at the German Foundation for World Population. I have Helle Agard, who's the Deputy Director of REACT, Action on Antibiotic Resistance. I have Dimitri Enikel, who is the EU Policy and Advocacy Advisor for Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, particularly their Access campaign. And Dr. Dimitri Pantelli, the Programme Manager and Senior Health Systems Analyst at the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies. So welcome to all of you. The way that we're going to run this session is we're going to have a sort of a short overview presentation just to make sure we're all on the same page, and then we'll have a panel conversation and hope you will play a very active role in participating in it. So, Dimitra, can I invite you to come and give us a brief overview, and you're particularly going to highlight the report that Sarah mentioned, this document you put together for the Swedish presidency. Your PowerPoint, Sarah's and others will be made available to people afterwards. So there's no need to panic and take all your pictures. Please, Dimitra, the floor is yours. And the clicker.
Yes, the clicker is right here. Thank you very much, Tamsin. Thank you very much, everyone, and EPHA for having us. My name is Dimitra Pantelli. I will, now that Sarah has risen all your expectations about our policy brief for the Swedish presidency, I'm going to try to summarize what we discuss in there in the next few slides as soon as they appear on the screen. Perhaps a couple of introductory words, and I'll try to do that very quickly. The observatory has been working in the area of AMR for several years, so this is not our first attempt, and I'm going to show you a couple of other outputs a bit later. But what we did, and we often support member states of the European Union when they have the presidency of the Council of the EU with evidence to underpin their thinking process and their discussions. And this is what we did with the Swedish presidency, who had a very clear intent on focusing on AMR, specifically in this case on antibiotics and how we can ensure sustainable and sustained access to effective antibiotics. And that means both new antibiotics and also existing antibiotics. We published a policy brief, which is available on our website, and our colleagues online have the advantage because they can see the link to the policy brief, which is hidden behind the Zoom part here, but you will have the slides as Tamsin said, so there's nothing to worry about. Oops. I will start with the challenges, and I'm assuming that many of you being here are familiar with them, perhaps. So if it's repetition, we say in my mother tongue in Greek, repetition is the mother of knowledge. So if that's repetition for you, well, it could be helpful. Major challenges that we see. First, when we think about the first group of medicines that I talked about, the new antibiotics that we need to address resistant pathogens, what are the major challenges for the research and development of new antibiotics? And here we do in the policy brief a little bit of stock taking. The WHO has looked at the antibiotic pipeline, newly approved and under development, and we see that in the years 2017 to 2021, we didn't have all that many new antibiotics, and the ones that we have, they're not really innovative, and in that way, they are also then prone to resistance and cross-resistance, so they are, of course, helpful, but they are limited in that sense. So in that context, or with that in mind, the clinical antibiotic pipeline has been described as insufficient to meet the challenge of AMR. And we need to think about fundamentally, as Sarah was saying, if we want to change it, we need to think about why that is and what drives this lack or dearth of really innovative new medicines. And on the one hand, we have scientific challenges. It's not easy to develop a new antibiotic, and this is something that we should not forget. There are particularities in what research looks like for antibiotics, which makes them particularly challenging. But on the other hand, we also have market challenges such as low volume sales. And clearly, if we think about it, antibiotics are medicines that you develop so as not to use them, preferably. And price competition with pre-existing generics. So the return of investment, the expected return of investment is low, and therefore the attractivity of developing new antibiotics is also low. So we need to think about that. What we also see in the landscape is that the large pharmaceutical companies have largely withdrawn from this area. This is linked, of course, to the previous. And most research and development is driven by academia and SMEs. And SMEs sometimes lack the technical and regulatory expertise to guide their candidates through development. So we see that different candidates fail across the development stages. And of course, they have significantly lower capital reserves than large pharmaceutical companies, and so struggle to secure funding. And as we will see in a moment, even when they manage to push a product through to market, sometimes they face substantial challenges after marketing and are often led to bankruptcy. Now, I talked about, sorry about the quick slides. We talked about this now, the challenge of developing new antibiotics and the industry landscape. Is the challenge over once new antibiotics are on the market? The answer, of course, is no. All of the figures are from the brief. And here again, online colleagues have the advantage of looking at it a bit more closely. But all you need to think about is that the bars give you a sense of how long it took for a sample of specific antibiotics to reach patients. So we see quite a big difference across European countries. So the longer the bar, the longer it took. And the blocks on the side show you, or the countries are ranked in a way from less availability to more availability. So the countries in the top, after a while, had 2 out of 5 available antibiotics on the market. Countries on the bottom had all 5 out of 5 of the sample that was examined here. So we see some significant variation, both in the time it takes for new antibiotics to be reimbursed and, in fact, in the number of antibiotics that end up being available. So access is inconsistent, and we see some hopeful results from new types of reimbursement models. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So all of that on new antibiotics. Difficult to develop them, not very attractive for the market. Industry landscape isn't helping necessarily, and we see very patchy and challenging access when we get them to the market. What happens with older antibiotics? And this is perhaps not clear for some that we do invest a lot of discussion and a lot of money in thinking about developing new antibiotics, but the majority of the infections that trouble us would be treatable with existing antibiotics if only we had good access to them, and access that is somehow coherent across different settings. But that is also not really the case, and we've seen that in particular last winter with shortages of medicines that became suddenly a very newsworthy topic. For those of us in this area, it has been really important and really obvious for many years, but this became also public issue. There are 2 main drivers that we recognize in the brief for the lack of availability of existing older antibiotics. One is financial considerations, that some are, for example, removed from markets where they were already launched before. And also, of course, that we have a fragility in the supply chain. What we see in antibiotics is that often we have single sources for active pharmaceutical ingredients that are located outside of Europe, mainly in China or India. So one explosion in a factory, for example, is sufficient to cause substantial problems in the production of these medicines. And we know that antibiotic shortages are quite a big problem. So I've already taken, I think, all of my allotment of time. So I see Tamsin getting a little bit ready to stop me here. So I'm going to summarize my next slides, which are perhaps the more important ones. I talked all about all the challenges. Now what? So what we're thinking about in the brief is that we need a holistic package of incentives to invigorate the pipeline, and that includes push incentives and pull incentives. So things that push research and development, such as direct funding and grants, but also pull incentives that somehow counteract this notion of commercial and attractiveness. And we have different types. We can have direct financial pull incentives, such as prospective purchase agreements, the Netflix model that Sarah mentioned, or indirect pull incentives, such as the transferable exclusivity extension, vouchers that are foreseen in the pharmaceutical revision, and other types like milestone payments. And we should focus those in those particular areas where we see problems. When it comes to existing or older antibiotics, we describe 3 main categories of action in the brief. One is tweaking regulatory levers, such as reducing or abolishing registration fees and adopting sunset clauses or harmonizing packaging. We think about purchasing approaches, even for the older medicines, like good procurement practice with sufficient volumes, prices, and suppliers, and delivery security clauses, but also joint purchasing, and again, the subscription models that delink basically the income of the manufacturer from the volume of sales. And of course, better understanding the supply chain and eventually strengthening the supply chain. So I've skipped over a little bit. The thing that I want to come to is that, of course, the focus of ensuring access to effective antibiotics is necessary, but when it comes to combating AMR, it's really narrow. What we need is the One Health approach. We heard it mentioned in the beginning. And EPHA organized an excellent session at the European Health Forum Gastein this year. So if you haven't watched that, I would invite you to go back and do that. And the very final thought is that we did this work for the Swedish presidency of the Council of the European Union. We did well, I think, so thank you, Sarah. But I think the presidency did even better because they produced this beautiful golden chain of antibiotic research and development and access, where we very clearly see that starting from the top left, where we think about discovery, this needs to be informed by public health needs and prioritization, of course. We have all the different stages, all the way to surveillance of resistance development, and all of those need to work, and they need to work coherently. So we may have focused today more on the development side of things or on pricing, which is one of the links, but we need to have this end-to-end view, and I think colleagues in the panel will reflect that in a minute. So thank you very much. Apologies for taking longer than I was supposed to, Samson.
Thank you very much. And again, it was a whirlwind tour through what you did. But what struck me really very hard was the extent to which governments have woken up to this. And there's been an acceleration of conversations, discussions, and policy initiatives. And what's also quite interesting to see is the extent to which that is goes well beyond just saying, well, we'll fix it with what's in the pharma legislation, the new pharma legislation. And you talked about regulatory issues, procurement issues. So there's a lot of issues we can unpack. But let me start. I'm going to start by inviting Dimitri to come in on this, because on one of your slides, Sarah, you said, look, there was last year 1,300 shortages, and even in some of the older antibiotics, this is a problem. Dimitri, in the work of your network in the Médecins Sans Frontières and the clinics and the support that you do across Europe and beyond, can you tell us more about what this actually means, the urgent need for new antibiotics and the challenges associated with making sure that we have them accessibly globally?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, EPHA, for organizing this session on a very, important topic and for inviting us here today. Let me start by saying that what we are seeing in our projects in different settings around the world is that AMR is on the rise at alarming levels, and we are seeing it in our healthcare projects. I can give you just a few examples. In Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, we see war wounded with the bone infections that have high levels of resistance, where bacteria have high levels of resistance. We see it in Niger, where children have sepsis, where the bacteria are already resistant to carbapenems, which are kind of later stage or kind of last resort type of antibiotics. In DRC, we see high levels of resistance in neonatal sepsis, with the bacteria already resistant to first-line antibiotics, etc. So these are the kind of things that we see in our projects, and it's highly concerning where we see it and the extent to which we are witnessing it. At the same time, while we see this high level of AMR, we also need to take into account that there is already a major challenge, as was also described by Dimitra in her slides, with access to existing antibiotics. It's estimated that about 5.7 million people worldwide die every year because they don't have access to the right antibiotics. And the element of equity and access is really strongly linked with the problem of AMR. Why is the AMR so high, or is AMR so high on the rise in these lower middle income countries? Well, because the conditions that fuel this resistance are quite strongly present there, particularly in the settings where we work, refugee camps, war wounded, or situations of conflict, etc., where infection control is limited, where prescription is not always done in the best possible ways, but also where there are shortages. And this is something which comes back in the pharmaceutical legislation. The problem with shortages, obviously, you can imagine stockouts being a problem here. Obviously, it's even a bigger problem outside the EU. And then the final point, I think, the lack of access to diagnostics and vaccines, which even makes it worse because you cannot diagnose correctly, so you're not treating correctly, you're overdosing or doing the wrong type of antibiotics, etc. So all of these elements are quite strongly present there. And the point here is when we want to address this challenge, and we need to learn from the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic, is we cannot do it with a fragmented approach. It has to be a global response to the crisis or to this problem that encompasses all the different elements, from infection control, diagnosis, to access to treatments, etc. And addressing the AMR will require addressing the inequity. And so also when we talk about innovation, that means that we're going to have to incorporate access in Europe, but also outside Europe, and really foster an innovation model that is kind of crafted in, that access will be built into that. So let me just leave it there perhaps, and we can talk more in detail later.
Thank you. It was, and that's quite startling to hear how much resistance you're finding in some of these countries to the newer antibiotics. And given the fact that, we have conflict, on the European continent right now, and we have conflict in Gaza, clearly this is an issue where you've described the challenges of doing good antibiotic treatment and stewardship under those conditions. So it's very clear this is something we need to address. Hella, I'm going to invite you to reflect. We heard in the earlier presentation some of the challenges of the whole development cycle. Can you give us a little bit more on how we overcome the barriers that are currently blocking making a way to sustainable access to effective antibiotics?
Yeah. So thank you, everyone, and thanks for also inviting REACT to participate today and provide our perspectives. For those of you who don't know REACT, we're a global network that has an office in Uppsala, Sweden, and have offices around the world in Latin America, Africa, and India. We have worked on the issue of antibiotic resistance. I mean, that's our sole focus. We've existed since 2005 and have sort of worked on the R&D issues for as long as we've existed, and really followed the debate for a very, very, very long time. And I think one of the key barriers to addressing all of these issues and all of these problems that we see throughout the whole chain is that there is this lack of overview. We tend to address this because it is a huge issue, a huge problem that is impacting different sectors, but also caused by different sectors. It can become a very overwhelming challenge to start addressing. So we have this tendency of trying to just break it into smaller challenges that we can then easier sort of have an overview over. But the risk there is that we kind of lose the overview and we lose the bigger picture. And I think that's one of the criticisms we had with the pharmaceutical legislation, because of course, it's limited what the pharmaceutical legislation can address in this whole chain of events that we need to address. But while you're doing it, you still need to keep in mind, what can you do? Like, how can you use the pharmaceutical legislation to have as much impact and enable as much as you can towards having an outcome that is sustainable access to effective antibiotics. So we need a kind of I would argue, something that is different that the European the European Action Plan on antimicrobial resistance. You need a sort of an end-to-end vision for the R&D to understand how all your different interventions are going to deliver against the goal of effective antibiotics. So if you start there, then you have a different measure. And I would argue today that's not the approach that's taken. The approach that is taken is like, big pharmaceutical companies have left the field of R&D. How do we address that? I think that's the wrong question to start with. You have to start with, how do we ensure that patients get affordable, sustainable access to effective antibiotics in the long term? Then you're going to start asking different questions to the interventions that you're proposing. How are they delivering towards that? So that would be my starting sort of opening remark of like having that end goal set to guide your interventions and asking the right questions to begin with if you want to actually be able to solve this problem.
Helle, before we move on, let me just check if I've understood what you're saying here, because you're inviting us to reflect on the fact that we've put a lot of attention on the fact that we've done a problem analysis and we say, here's the problem. Big pharma are pulling out of antibiotic R&D, which means the people are doing it small SMEs. And we saw on Dimitra's slides, a lot of them, they run out of money. They don't have the capacity. So the answer is therefore, how do we entice big pharma back in? What do big pharma want? They want profits. Let's find a way to make it financially interesting. And you're inviting us to say, look, that's a very small part of the issue. And you're asking the wrong question. Have I understood it? That we're focusing just on this piece and we need a much bigger picture as part of that sort of golden chain that was on Dimitra's slide?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, even if you were to succeed, which I think you won't with the proposals you have on the table to pull in the bigger companies and the multinationals in this again, you still haven't solved 95% of the equation. So, it's not going to get us to where we are. And I think there's a risk also in the political debate that, has a tendency to also be political and by extension, perhaps not as detailed as it needs to be, that you see this as a panacea that will solve, the issue of antibiotic resistance. It won't.
Okay.
A transferable exclusivity voucher will not solve the bigger issue. And that's what we need to keep in mind. Even if you put that in place, then what?
Okay.
What do we do with the drugs that are being developed? How do we ensure that they're affordable after they've been developed? And how do we ensure that they're managed in a sustainable way and used in a sustainable way?
Thank you. Let me invite Rosa to come in now, because the sort of big piece of legislation that's on the table, the big change that's coming, it's the first time in a generation we've looked at this legislation, which is the pharma package. Tell us more about what's written in there at the moment and how would it impact the development of new antibiotics? We saw on the slides from Dimitra and this sort of review that the pipeline is relatively weak and what's coming through is not all that innovative. So how would the proposals in the draft piece of legislation affect the development of new antibiotics?
Can you hear me? Okay, can you hear me now?
Switching on always helps.
A little bit.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thanks for the invitation. I'm Rosa Castro. I work now for DSW, which is a global health and development organization. I have been very privileged to work before with many of you in the Alliance for Responsible R&D and Affordable Medicines and at EPHA. So my comments are a bit, a mix of what I have done in the past and what I'm doing right now. So I don't want to repeat what you in the panel have said, but I think that we subscribe to many of the things because some of these ideas I had the privilege of developing, them or developing the thoughts together about, how to approach the issue of the development of new antibiotics and access at the same time, because innovation and access have always been a very difficult mix to combine, not only for antibiotics, in general for pharmaceutical products. So one thing, I don't think there are magic recipes, and I think that became very clear. I don't want to repeat what you have said, but I would like to emphasize one point, which is the global dimension of the EU pharmaceutical legislation. In my current work, we have been insisting in this point because it was missing completely from the text, not even like a recital saying that, the pharmaceutical legislation in the EU has an impact outside of the EU, which seems like very basic, but it is an important recognition. And in the past, actually, the EU legislation has set the model for many legislations around the world. So now I'm going into the more, regulation legislation point of view. There is a big impact. And it's very important for the EU to recognize that impact, especially in low and middle income countries, and especially, as you have explained in the panel, because AMR is not equally distributed across the globe. The biggest burden remains in low and middle income countries. So that's a very important acknowledgement. A second point, why it should be more global, the pharmaceutical legislation, is because here at least, we're talking about global health threats. So there is no way that you can address AMR with a kind of Eurocentric approach only. And that's also true for the field I'm working right now, which is a field that has some things in common. Poverty-related and neglected diseases are those predominantly affecting people in low and middle income countries, there is no commercial incentive for companies to invest in these areas. So that's a big market failure, a little bit like antibiotics. And you could say that AMR has been a neglected disease in a way. So what about what has been proposed? What has been proposed initially by the European Commission was this transferable exclusivity voucher. I don't think we have time to go into all the flaws, but I would like to mention at least two things. There is big things that we don't know about the transferable exclusivity voucher. And the big reason is that this is a model that has never been tested, has been actually proposed in the US and in different parts of the world. There has been consideration about this, and at different points of time, it has been rejected because of many reasons. One of these is the things that we do know about exclusivity extension, and that's that it comes at a very high cost. So it's, I know I have to like just, come to an end very quickly. I'll just say that, so the things that we do know is that it's very high cost, and that we need these as part of a toolbox, just as Dimitra showed in that I think the final slide. It's part of a kind of push and pull scheme of incentives, and it's also part of a broader set of policies that will help us deal and fight with AMR. So if we put all the money into one of the pieces of this puzzle, it's going to be very difficult to see how we can do the rest. Now, the good thing, to finish with a nice positive thought, is that there are good alternatives, and these are coming basically from different places. The EU HERA developed a study that looked into some alternatives. The EU HERA is actually considering piloting one of those for different antibiotics, and right now it's good to see that they are doing a prioritization exercise to see which antibiotics to use in the first piloting. The council recommendations also came clearly in that direction. And finally, also the amendments proposed by different political parties in the European Parliament have looked into that direction.
So that sounds like it's quite a positive outlook that you've put there at the end, that what was put in the Commission's proposal, which was, these vouchers, which was new and innovative in the sense they've never been done before, but the co-legislators, that's the council and the parliament, are looking at this and saying, well, we're not necessarily happy with that, but we're interested in exploring other models. And you highlighted the step forward of HERA, which is, again, because it is itself a new agency, is looking to see how it can innovate in new ways forward. I'm going to ask all of you now to think, if we don't like the vouchers, and clearly I get the sense we could have a whole webinar just on the vouchers and the merits or gaps on that. What should we, what incentive structure should we be putting forward that would prioritize both stimulating the development of new antibiotics, so looking at that, early discovery stage, but also then making sure once you've got them that we've got equitable access. And I was struck again by the slide, Dimitri, you had showing the huge gap between how many antibiotics are then available and how long it takes. So they are two elements of the same question. Who would like to pick up on that? What should be the incentive structure that we could propose? Great, thank you, Hella. I was looking to you, but I was, in case you were uncomfortable, I wasn't going to put you on the spot.
So we've been looking at this, as I mentioned, for a very long time, and actually wrote a report back in 2020 that explored what options are there, what can we do to solve this. And I think there's a lot of promise in milestone prices. I think HERA is completely right to be looking at this for a number of reasons. Because it's targeting the actors that are actually in the field and not those that are not in the field and have left it. It's really, it's a tool that can also easily be combined with requirements. So you can easily attach requirements to the public funding you are making available for developers to also require other things. And I think that's crucial if you want to address the other barriers that are also there, the problems with not sharing data, the problems that people are, continuing to repeating the same mistakes in R&D because we don't have a good overview of research that's been done in the past and mistakes that's been done in the past. So we're also having a quite ineffective financing and funding R&D system because we don't, we keep continuing making the same mistakes, and we're not able to solve, scientific challenges that have actually been a huge barrier to progress over the last 30 years. It's the same issues on the table that we haven't been able to solve. So that's a major obstacle that, regardless of whether you have a transferable exclusivity voucher, that's still going to be an issue. Okay, so you want to have you want to leverage the public interventions in the maximum possible kind of way to achieve progress on addressing all of these different obstacles that are there and barriers that are there that are not just financial but also non-financial. And I think milestone prizes is a good tool to combine those two, to think about, providing a financial solution, which it shouldn't be underestimated. Of course, it is a huge thing also for SMEs that the financing is not there. But it's also the other areas that we need to be looking at, and we have to keep that in mind. And that's why I think it's good to have that overarching view of like a goal that we need to get to, and how do we design every single step that we do in all parts of the chain to deliver against that goal to the biggest extent possible.
Thank you. So sort of you're encouraging us to think about how if we prioritize public funding in that early stage research, we can also insist that that involves a lot of information sharing and it's open. So, we move everyone forward to a sort of further upon starting point, so we don't repeat these circles of failure and because no information is shared.
Right. But I would also say that, that there's this tendency to think about milestone prices as something that we do upstream, like milestone prices it's a pull incentive, on equal terms, if we're talking about pull incentives as all the other ones that come later on. It's just that you divide it up and you do it earlier on. And I would also say that there's been it's an unpublished study as far as I know now, but the Swedish I can't remember the English word for it, but the Swedish Authority for Dentistry and CLV, yeah. They've just done a study, and it's forthcoming, where they're looking at milestone prices, they're looking at these different options, and also for the first time including the transferable exclusivity voucher. And the voucher comes out performing the worst. So, that there is also, emerging evidence coming out now to show like what is it that is the most effective, what options are more effective to getting us to where we need to go.
Dimitri, go ahead.
I completely agree with what Helle said. But I want to add here that I think that when we're asking ourselves a little bit the wrong question when we ask, what is the incentive that will solve this problem? In a sense of, it's not an incentive that will deliver one kind of magical cure, as was mentioned before, that is going to solve our problem here. It's about the ecosystem of how we do the R&D and what it should deliver and for who. Because the problem is so wide that we cannot just target it, with one product or one kind of incentive alone. I can give you the example for, as was mentioned before, the burden of AMR is quite high in low and middle income countries already. Now, what we see as a lack of R&D that is currently happening is clinical trials, late stage clinical trials taking place in low and middle income countries, where these high levels of resistance are already present. So, at the moment, the way that R&D is often organized is looking at strains of resistance that are present here in high income countries where the market is supposed to be more profitable, etc. But, we're missing a point if we're not looking at where the levels of resistance are much higher. If we're not trying to enroll patients like children, pregnant women that are a lot more difficult to include in trials, or people who have sepsis where you only have a couple of hours sometimes to save their lives, that it's not an easy setup to organize a clinical trial. So we need to find a way to, set up clinical trials in these kind of contexts where resistance are already present, etc. And a transferable exclusivity voucher won't solve that problem. That's not the way we're going to solve this problem so much. So it's more about targeted investments, milestone prices, funds, etc. And I particularly think about some of a partner that we often work with as well, with GuardP, that has a lot more this approach of doing R&D, where access, affordability, licensing to local producers is already included in the model that they organize. And coming back to the point of the cost. The cost of the voucher, if I remember well from the impact assessment, is about 440 million euro for one voucher. GuardP has, I think 2 days ago, launched its new strategy, and they're a non-for-profit model, obviously, or very limited profits only model that they use. They have a budget that they ask 220 million for the next 5 years to develop 6 antibiotics. So it gives you the scale of how much you can do with this, with the same amount of money, depending on the approach that you take.
Yep. Thank you. I mean, the GuardP model is one that's very interesting to look at and explore. Dimitri, you've got some suggestions.
Yes, I have perhaps a couple of reflections on the incentive first, and then on the global dimension. On the incentive, I think clearly, colleagues, we agree that this element of delinking revenue from sales is important, but this is on the pull side of things, perhaps. But we really need the push incentives as well, because we saw, or maybe I didn't show it in detail, that early stage research is also really important. So I think for me, the danger is that if we focus too much on the pull incentive and pull all the funding from the push incentives to fund the pull incentive, then we have another problem that we really shouldn't induce ourselves. That's one thing. The other thing that I would like to link with that is the role of the EU in a way. So I could think perhaps of a structure, of an incentive structure that incorporates something like the advanced purchase agreements that we saw for the vaccines in COVID-19, where we come together with a joint purchasing approach, where we think about how different member states might contribute, and then we have one joint pull incentive. Whenever we've thought about things like that, it's very hard to implement, clearly. But it isn't unthinkable, and I think if anywhere we have a chance in succeeding, it really is AMR, because we see the common denominator for the problem for all of us. Final thought, linking to what Rosa was saying, and exactly in this dimension of how do we work together within Europe, not across, but beyond Europe. Also important link to what Dimitri was just saying, is the EU has a strong voice. It has strong links to the G7, to the G20. It's possible to actually leverage those to think globally how we make accessible the antibiotics that we develop. We have a couple of thoughts in the policy brief. Interestingly, in the EU Global Health Strategy, AMR is clearly recognized as a priority area. So perhaps that is the way to anchor it, even if it's not sufficiently anchored in the pharmaceutical legislation. So we do have hooks if we really want to use them.
Rosa, and then I'm coming to you. So get ready with your questions and comments.
That last comment by Dimitri is perfect, because I don't want to repeat again, but I think it's very important to find the right hooks. And for the EU then to assume this maybe leadership in maybe having a dialogue with other parts of the world is I think it's pretty clear that there's no silver bullet. I mean, like no incentive is gonna do the trick, and that you need a mix, and that you need to move those products along the pipeline. So you need a mix of push and pull incentives, and the money is not infinite. So that's the point here. If you put all of that into one incentive mechanism as the voucher with a very high price, that's going to be very, very tricky or very risky. And maybe that's a good also connection with the next panel, because I think a big question here is, how much is really the cost for developing a new antibiotic? I mean, the truth is that I don't think we have a really good estimation, except the estimations coming from non-for-profit, like the GuardP and in other areas. And just to bring back an example from the area I'm working right now, and I'm learning a lot of new things, I think it will be a good point also to learn from each other, because neglected diseases are one of the most, damn difficult areas. I mean, completely neglected. You wouldn't even know many of the diseases that we are working, because they affect people living in very poor areas of the world. And what has worked in some cases, in the last few decades especially, has been working together with the non-for-profit sector, because obviously the commercial sector is not going to have the leadership. It's not going to take the leadership on this. You need the public sector, the non-for-profit, that is really into this to go and move, those products. And what has worked is also a mix of things. So product development partnerships, PDPs working together, sometimes with the industry, obviously for the last part of the development of the products, but with this kind of, how can I say, moral vision that people should have access, because what you need at the end is really to the right antibiotic, let's say, for the right infection at in the right place, right? So that's what and that means that you need to have diagnostics as well, and you need to have vaccines, and you need to prevent things from happening.
Thank you very much. And it's, again, it strikes me that when we look at the sort of pharma package, this other area about diagnostics is completely missing, the sort of basic lab tools that we need to allow us to effectively use the right medication. Maybe because that's not covered by that particular piece of legislation, but it demonstrates the challenge of using an instrument that we have because it's on the table, and then trying to use that to hit all of the different bits of the problem, and it clearly doesn't work. I'm going to open the floor for you. Yes, Emmy, can I invite you to take the microphone? Just tell us who you are, please, and then your question or comment.
Thanks very much. My name's Elaine Cruikshanks from Acumen Public Affairs, and doing quite a lot of work in the pharma area, including AMR. There are, as ever in panels, a lot of things one agrees with, and I think everybody agrees that this is a very complicated issue. I hope everybody agrees, and I think the reason why we're here today is it's also a very urgent issue. We've been discussing various types of incentives and what we should do for some years now. And the Commission, in its wisdom, did a very extensive impact assessment as well. And in one particular piece of legislation, which is a draft regulation, which is about medicinal products, which is why they've concentrated on incentives on medicinal products and how you get them to, how you get the R&D done.
Yep.
They have come up with one particular incentive, which happens to be, a push incentive, because they get diagnosed that with that piece of legislation, they could help in that particular part of the chain. And what they came up with was transferable exclusivity vouchers as a way forward, and said, let's try it and let's trial it, because we need to do something. We need to do something. People have been talking and talking for years and years about what should we do. Yep. We now have an opportunity, because of the revision, once in 20 years of this revision of the pharma legislation, to do something now at EU level. Now, why TEVs at EU level? Because money, the size of the money and the incentive is important. It costs probably about 1 billion to 1.5 billion to actually even get the R&D towards what it needs to be.
What's the question you like to ask?
Well, have they thought about the chain, and the chain in terms of this particular piece of legislation that you discussed is actually looking at one part of the chain. HERA, as you mentioned, is looking at other parts of the chain. Right. Member states, in their wisdom, are looking at other parts of the chain as well. It's horses for courses is what I'm saying. And you need to fit them together. We're a very messy structure, EU, but it also has opportunities. So revenue guarantees are looked at, or pay for play, if you want to call it, in Sweden and the UK. That is very complementary, actually, to a TEV, because one actually keeps the revenue guarantees, keep the antibiotic in the market. The TEVs push the R&D to get there. And Elaine, that is a model. That is the model that's been used in all pharma.
You like the vouchers?
R&D is messy. It takes 10 to 15 years for any novel pharmaceutical
Elaine,
to get to market. So my question is, why would you go to a completely public funded method of doing it when it's been proved not to work?
So your whole point is, why go for a fully public funded model if that's what you think is being proposed by anyone?
Medical facilities in the draft regulation amendments from MEP Volkan. Do you think that will work?
Okay, thank you.
We have not been convinced by the voucher in any ways. In the question, there was a point that was kind of saying the model hasn't worked for 20 years to deliver. That's an exclusive. We're working in an exclusivity-based model today, right? And that hasn't delivered today. So extending that by another year, for us, doesn't seem to be solving all the different challenges around. No. I understand the concept very well. I find it even ironic that at the one side, the industry says that 1 year of exclusivity.
I'm sorry, could you
but
just
can you
listen to the response? You took a long time to ask a question. Could you have the courtesy to listen to the response, please?
Okay. So I think it's a bit ironic that on the one side, the industry also says that, 1 year of exclusivity is not sufficient as an incentive to launch in all the 27 member states. But then this 1 year transferable exclusivity voucher would solve all the different problems that were presented by Dimitra in 1 year. That's kind of absurd in my opinion. There is a challenge for sure in terms of investments, etc., and that will require a lot of public investments. Whether it's in the voucher or any other form, there will be a lot of money needed. The question is how we distribute that. And do we distribute it by one voucher at the very end and hope that it will solve the problem? Or do we use other models where we're going to distribute it more targetedly to achieve the objectives that we want, which is both develop the antibiotics, but also make them affordable, available, etc.
Okay, thank you. If you want to make an additional point, please go ahead, because I'm aware that we've got about 7 minutes left and I'd like other people to also speak. Yes, go ahead.
It's fine, I can wait.
Well, if you... Let's take your input and then I will come back to you, Dimitra, because we need to address that. Do you want to stand up? Yeah, that's it.
Yes.
Thanks.
Hi, Anna from the Greens Group. So thank you so much for the panel. I think that, on the voucher, most of member states already are not convinced by the voucher. Majority of the parliament doesn't seem to be convinced by the voucher. Problem is that the voucher is kind of the only thing on R&D that sort of fits within the scope of the legislation. The treaties and the scope of legislation, we are bound by it. So when we were trying to be a bit creative, such as Timo and us including, we were browsing out a little bit farther. But of course, what I think should have been done is not 2 pieces of legislation in the pharmaceutical package, but 3 already. Because if we and I absolutely agree with you that the milestone payments and subscription models and so on are useful. HERA agrees it's useful. We had this amazing STOA study done at the parliament, which looked at the different incentives, and it did say, look, the exclusivities, they work for innovation for the sake of innovation. It doesn't work when you are actually targeting a specific unmet need. We need these other incentives to look at. So the problem is right now, all we can do at the negotiation table is really agree that we're going to get rid of the voucher. But the problem is here that, of course, politically, we are not solving the problem of AMR. And we are not solving the problem of the lack of AMR incentive and the right way to do it. So you really need to pressure the Commission to do not only impact assessment or whether the voucher is good or not. I mean, no one's even... I even doubt the Commission's really convinced that the voucher is good, even though they have it. But they do need to look more into what HERA suggested and what STOA suggested, and then possibly come back with another piece of legislation that would solve that. But of course, it's not going to solve the immediate. Mm-hmm. So our hands are a bit tied, but it's a very complex issue, of course. But I absolutely agree with the panel that the voucher is very, very flawed, and I can also talk about it for a long time.
Okay, the panel's exciting. I've got lots of responses on that. Okay.
Figure out a way to make it short.
Fantastic.
Okay. Very good. I think the main point with the voucher was the worry that we would have thought we solved it. So if that is the solution that is put on the table for AMR, I would say it's not the best solution, and it's definitely not a sufficient solution. Now, if we take the voucher off the table, the problem is we may not have another solution. So I think what we really need to think about is how we actually come up with the right solutions and how we actually implement them.
Okay. And Hele, I think have we got a good response to Dimitra to say, okay, if not that, then this is what we should do?
I'll start a different place, but try to end there. So I agree very much on the point that you're raising on the urgency. But I would probably argue that if you care about urgency, transferable exclusivity voucher, that will be a reality in 5 to 6 years from now, is probably not the way we need to go. And if you look at the proposals that HERA has on the table, that's actually, that doesn't require any legal changes. What it requires is political commitment and financing. And that's where we need to turn to the member states. So I'm actually more worried that continuing with the discussion on a highly inefficient model like the TEV, the voucher, for another 5-6 years will detract that really important political momentum of time, resources, and political will to solve a problem that we have right now. And I think that's a really crucial point. The momentum is here right now, and it's been partly created by the proposal of the transferable exclusivity vouchers. So it's not all bad. It's really engaged across the board, a lot of different actors that weren't in the field before. So thank you for that. I will give it that.
Yeah.
But I think the political momentum is here now, and the question is financing. That's where we need to start and end this conversation. And that eventually will stop at in the council's table and the member states, and really pose them the question. And I would probably not be so afraid, even if I've worked in this field for so long, to go to them and say, okay, the voucher's off the table, now what? Because I think the political momentum is here now to make the push and the pressure on member states to actually then, decide on something else, come up with something, be willing to commit on something else, be willing to commit funding where it's needed.
Thank you.
That would be my proposal.
Rosa, I know you wanted to come in on this, and then I'll invite Dimitri also.
My first point was exactly what Helle said. If we want to, and I agree with the urgency, we all agree with the urgency of the problem, but actually the pharmaceutical legislation is going to take years to be negotiated. But the second thing, the alternatives, I think one question that, sometimes it's good to look back. And one thing that was a bit lost in the impact assessments of the pharma legislation, honestly, was really a good assessment of alternatives. And there were some at the beginning, and there were some alternatives that actually, Anna, could work in the pharmaceutical legislation because they either were tied to accelerated approval of the product. So that actually the voucher comes, this exclusivity extension voucher comes from a thing that is working in the US for neglected diseases initially, and it was a priority review voucher. So instead of extending the exclusivity, it was giving priority review for a product. So that is a completely different thing. It's a completely different cost. So we're talking about 100 million instead of 1 billion, for instance. But that's not good enough reasons to discard completely other mechanisms. The other one was play or pay model. And this comes from a very important report, very impactful report looking at the alternatives. The O'Neill report, I think, was looking already at pool incentives and already say, well, transferable exclusivity extensions don't look like a good idea, but actually play or pay model could be a good way to raise money. And then the issue, I agree completely, is about financing. If we want to urgently address, what we need is the political will to put these funds into good use.
Yeah, I'm going to invite, because we're heading towards coffee break. So Dimitri, and then Helle, you can have a final word. Go ahead, Dimitri. Oh.
I have not much to add. Very strong panelists here, so I have not much to add. Just to say that, I don't think that the pharmaceutical legislation can solve all the problems. So we have to address the right problems with the right tools. And I don't think that the pharmaceutical legislation is necessarily the right tool to incentivize the development of antibiotics. There are other tools where political commitment as financing, as has been mentioned, are a lot more important today than that particular opening that is there now.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that was maybe, do we have another time for another question, or can
we won't, because it's already time for coffee break.
Okay,
so
okay.
We may pick up on the issue just after the coffee break. We're going to talk looking at how we ensure transparency of R&D costs. So we may pick up on some issues, but make your final point, both of you.
So I will make a really short point on just the point that was raised by the two comments that were made there. I would really warn against this, what I think is a false narrative that, if we don't do it here, then we've failed completely. I think it's much more important to get a system in place that will function and that will work and that will deliver what we need. So I really urge both policymakers and those that are engaged in the discussions here to not kind of go into this sort of if we don't put anything in the pharmaceutical legislation, then it's all lost. I really don't think it is. And I think it's also missing the point of the wider discussions that are happening globally on how to address antibiotic resistance and how to address the R&D questions, which are also progressing, and you have other avenues to pursue it. So yeah, I would argue along with you to also keep the global perspective here, and make sure that EU interventions are addressing those also and contributing to the global solutions that we need.
Thank you. Dimitra, you started us off with an overview. Would you like to finish us off as well?
And I will build right on that, because that was exactly my point before. And then also two of my points actually on the global dimension. Just to end, we know that for the next United Nations General Assembly next September, we have a parallel session that is being organized on AMR. We have the Global Leaders Group on AMR. So there is a lot of action, and that's the point, that the EU action and the EU voice should not be limited to the debate around the transferable exclusivity extension, because that's really only a really small part of it. We really should be strong about finding solutions that are effective for the global perspective.
Excellent. And on that note, can we say a warm thank you to the members of our panel?